Before the pharmacy on every corner and before the doctor's office had a waiting room full of people, there was the kitchen. In 1928, a woman in rural Appalachia treated her family's ailments the same way her mother had, and her grandmother before that, with what grew in the garden, what sat in the pantry, and the specific knowledge of what to do with it. Number 16 on this list was used so consistently by traditional healers across the American South that medical researchers at 3 separate universities began studying it in the 1990s and confirmed what great-grandmothers had known for a century. Number 9 was dismissed by the medical establishment for 50 years before modern nutritional science confirmed that the women recommending it since the Civil War era were correct in every important respect. And number 1, the food that great-grandmothers across every region reached for first when someone in the household was unwell, has been so thoroughly replaced by pharmaceutical products that most people today do not know it exists as a food at all. These 20 foods were not magic. They were the practical application of centuries of careful observation by women who paid attention to what worked and remembered what did not. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 healing foods our great-grandmothers swore by that modern medicine forgot. This video presents historical and cultural food traditions for informational and educational purposes only. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional for medical advice. Number 20. Raw honey. Before antibiotics and before antiseptic creams came in tubes from the pharmacy, great-grandmothers applied raw honey to wounds, burns, and skin infections with the confidence of people who had seen it work. They stirred it into hot water with lemon for sore throats. They kept a jar in the kitchen the way modern households keep a first aid kit. Raw honey, meaning honey that had not been heated or filtered, contained enzymes and compounds that processed commercial honey does not, and folk tradition understood the difference long before the science existed to explain it. Modern researchers studying honey's antimicrobial properties have confirmed that the women applying it to wounds in 1920 were applying something with genuine biological activity. The jar of raw honey that sat in the great-grandmother's kitchen was not superstition. It was applied knowledge accumulated over generations of observation. Number 19. Bone broth. Long before wellness culture discovered bone broth and began selling it at $8 a cup, great-grandmothers made it every week from the bones of whatever animal had been cooked for Sunday dinner. The chicken carcass went into cold water with onion, celery, carrot, and a splash of vinegar. The vinegar drew minerals out of the bones more effectively than water alone. It simmered for hours until the broth set like gelatin when cooled overnight. This broth was given to sick family members before any other food because great-grandmothers knew from experience that the people who drank it recovered their strength faster. The gelatin derived from collagen in the bones is now understood to support gut lining integrity and joint function. The minerals it extracted from bones are now sold separately as supplements, at prices that would have confused a woman who made the same thing for free every week from what she was going to throw away anyway. Number 18. Garlic. Great-grandmothers across every immigrant community in America maintained an absolute conviction that raw garlic had protective properties that cooked garlic could not replicate. They ate it raw, they infused it in honey, and they gave it to children at the first sign of respiratory illness. The compound in raw garlic, now known as allicin, is produced when raw garlic is crushed and allowed to rest for several minutes before use. It has been studied extensively for its antimicrobial properties. Folk tradition discovered the crushing and resting step through careful observation. The great-grandmothers who insisted the garlic had to be raw and had to be chopped rather than swallowed whole were preserving a specific preparation method that matters significantly to the compound's effectiveness. Number 17. Apple cider vinegar. The brown glass bottle with sediment at the bottom, called the mother, was a fixture in great-grandmothers' kitchens across rural America for 100 years. It was taken by the spoonful in water for digestive complaints, for sore throats, and for a general malaise that great-grandmothers described as the system being out of sorts. The specific tradition of taking it in warm water with honey before meals traces through American folk medicine back to at least the Civil War era. The acetic acid in apple cider vinegar and the probiotic bacteria in unpasteurized versions have been the subject of significant research interest. Great-grandmothers who kept the bottle with the mother and threw away bottles without it were making a distinction that modern science now understands. Before the elderberry supplement industry was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, wild elderberries grew along fence lines and creek beds, and great-grandmothers gathered them every autumn, turning them into a syrup the family took through the winter months. They simmered the berries with water, honey, ginger, and cinnamon until reduced to a thick, dark syrup. Families gave it by the spoonful at the first sign of a cold or the flu. Researchers have been studying specific compounds in elderberries since the 1990s. Those compounds include flavonoids, which appear to interfere with viral replication. For 50 years, much of the medical community dismissed elderberry syrup as folk medicine. Then, over the next 20 years, the same medical community published peer-reviewed studies on the very preparation great-grandmothers had been making from fence-line shrubs for generations. Number 15. Ginger. Fresh ginger root, kept in the kitchen, was used at the first sign of nausea or respiratory illness. Great-grandmothers grated it into hot water with honey. They simmered it into teas. They candied it for children who would not take it any other way. The anti-nausea properties of ginger have been confirmed across multiple clinical settings, including chemotherapy-related nausea and morning sickness. Great-grandmothers who reached for ginger root when someone was nauseated were reaching for something that works with a reliability that several pharmaceutical anti-nausea preparations cannot consistently match. The ginger root still sits in the produce section of every grocery store. The knowledge of how to use it the way great-grandmothers used it has become genuinely rare. Here is something worth sitting with before we continue. The women who used these foods were not practicing alternative medicine. They were practicing the only medicine available to them in the circumstances they inhabited. A farm family in rural Kentucky in 1910 did not have access to a physician within reasonable distance on most days. What they had was the accumulated knowledge of which plants and foods had reliably reduced suffering across generations of careful observation. That knowledge was not superstition in the dismissive sense the word implies. It was evidence-based medicine practiced by people who had no other term for it. The evidence was experiential rather than clinical, gathered through watching what happened to the people who ate certain things over decades and generations, and refined through the transmission of what worked. Modern medicine has since confirmed a remarkable percentage of what folk tradition identified as effective, not because folk tradition was guessing correctly, but because generations of careful women were paying closer attention than anyone gave them credit for. Number 14. Turmeric in warm milk. The tradition of warming milk with turmeric and honey appeared in multiple immigrant communities across America throughout the early 20th century. South Asian families brought it from a tradition thousands of years old. Other communities arrived at similar preparations independently through careful observation. Great-grandmothers who gave this preparation to family members with joint pain or inflammation were using something that modern researchers have spent decades studying. The compound curcumin in turmeric has been the subject of more research papers than almost any other food compound in the past 30 years. Great-grandmothers who added black pepper to the turmeric preparation were unknowingly exploiting the fact that piperine in black pepper increases curcumin absorption significantly. They did not know the mechanism. They knew it worked better with the pepper. Number 13. Fermented foods. Before the probiotic supplement industry, great-grandmothers fermented foods. They made sauerkraut in ceramic crocks in the cellar, pickles in brine, cultured buttermilk and clabber, kimchi in Korean-American households, and kvass in Eastern European homes. Folk tradition understood fermentation to support digestive health in ways that fresh foods did not. When great-grandmothers fed fermented foods to family members recovering from illness, they were giving living cultures of beneficial bacteria that modern medicine now sells in capsule form for $30 a bottle. The bacteria in a well-made fermented vegetable are the same types found in commercial probiotic supplements, and often far more numerous. Families who kept a crock of sauerkraut going in the cellar maintained a probiotic supply that cost nothing and replenished itself continuously. Number 12. Oatmeal poultice. Before hydrocortisone cream, great-grandmothers treated skin irritation, rashes, and sunburn with a paste of finely ground oatmeal and water applied directly to the skin. The relief was real, and it happened fast enough to be noticed by even skeptical family members. The compounds in colloidal oatmeal, including beta-glucans and avenanthramides, have since been confirmed to have genuine anti-inflammatory activity when applied topically. Colloidal oatmeal is now the active ingredient in several expensive commercial skin treatments. Great-grandmothers who made the same preparation from a canister of rolled oats in the kitchen cabinet were applying the same compound at a cost of fractions of a cent rather than $12 a tube. The spoonful of cod liver oil given to children every morning through the winter months was not a gentle tradition. Children resisted. Great-grandmothers insisted. What great-grandmothers were providing, without knowing the mechanism, was vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids in a form the body absorbs efficiently. Vitamin D deficiency, now recognized as widespread in northern latitudes during winter and associated with increased susceptibility to respiratory illness, was something great-grandmothers addressed empirically through the daily spoonful before any researcher had measured vitamin D levels or understood their relationship to immune function. The tradition was correct. The mechanism was not understood until decades later. Here is what happened to folk food medicine between 1950 and 1980 that explains why most of this knowledge is nearly gone. The pharmaceutical industry that expanded dramatically after World War II needed patients who believed that illness required purchased intervention. A mother who reached for elderberry syrup, raw honey, and bone broth when her children were sick was not a customer. A mother who reached for a bottle from the pharmacy was. The campaign to replace traditional food remedies with pharmaceutical products was not a conspiracy. It was a market operating according to its own logic. The medical establishment, which had legitimate reasons to be suspicious of folk claims, adopted a skepticism toward traditional food knowledge that went further than the evidence warranted. By the time researchers began confirming that elderberries had measurable antiviral properties and that fermented foods supported gut health in clinically meaningful ways, the generation of women who had maintained those practices had largely passed. The knowledge they carried did not go into the medical literature. It went with them. Number 10. Chicken soup. Not chicken soup as comfort food alone, but as a preparation that great-grandmothers understood to have specific effects on respiratory illness that other hot liquids did not replicate. The steam opened airways. The broth replaced fluids and electrolytes. The compounds released from the chicken during long simmering have since been studied and found to have measurable effects on the inflammatory response in nasal passages. A peer-reviewed study confirmed that chicken soup had clinically measurable effects on mucus movement compared to plain hot water. Great-grandmothers who insisted that only chicken soup would do, and not plain broth or any other hot liquid, were making a distinction that modern research has since validated. Number 9. Raw apple cider vinegar and honey in warm water, the morning tonic. Taken together on an empty stomach, first thing in the morning, this preparation was considered by great-grandmothers across multiple American traditions to be the foundational daily tonic that kept the system functioning correctly. A tablespoon of each in a cup of warm water, taken consistently through the winter months. The practice appears in American folk medicine records going back to at least the early 1800s. The individual properties of each component have been studied extensively. The specific combination and timing align with what current nutritional science understands about the conditions under which each component is most effectively absorbed. The specificity of the preparation, the combination, the proportion, the timing suggests a level of empirical refinement that deserves more respect than the dismissal it received for most of the 20th century. Number 8. Willow bark tea. Before aspirin was synthesized in 1897, great-grandmothers who knew plant medicine made a bitter tea from the inner bark of willow trees and gave it to family members with fever, headache, and joint pain. The active compound in willow bark is salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, the same compound from which aspirin is derived. Aspirin is willow bark tea made more concentrated, more predictable, and more convenient. Great-grandmothers who made willow bark tea were not practicing something that aspirin replaced with something better. They were practicing the original from which aspirin was derived. The pharmaceutical product is the descendant. The willow bark tea is the ancestor. Number 7. Mullein leaf tea. The tall plant with fuzzy gray-green leaves that grows along roadsides across America was known to great-grandmothers as the respiratory herb, used for persistent cough, congestion, and bronchial complaints. Dried mullein leaves were simmered in water, then strained carefully through cloth to remove the fine hairs that could irritate the throat. The tea was sweetened with honey and given warm several times a day. The mucilaginous compounds in mullein coat and soothe irritated mucous membranes, and they have been studied in research contexts. The traditional practice of simmering rather than steeping and of straining through cloth reflects specific technical knowledge learned through experience. That technical specificity is the clearest possible evidence that the women who maintained this tradition observed carefully and refined their practice over time. Number 6. Yarrow tea for fever. Yarrow, the flat-topped white wildflower that grows in fields across America, was known to great-grandmothers as the fever plant. It was the preparation given at the first sign of a rising temperature, meant to promote sweating and help the fever break naturally. The active compounds in yarrow have been studied for their effects on circulation and inflammation. The traditional understanding that yarrow helped a fever break rather than suppressing it reflects a folk wisdom about the function of fever that is closer to current immunological understanding than the suppression approach that dominated conventional medicine for most of the 20th century. Great-grandmothers who promoted sweating rather than suppressing fever were working with the body's own mechanisms rather than against them. There is a reason why every culture on Earth arrived at overlapping versions of many of these practices. Honey applied to wounds, garlic taken at the onset of illness, fermented foods for digestive complaints, broths made from bones. These are not coincidences of geography or superstition traveling across cultures. They are the convergent findings of millions of careful observers over thousands of years, arriving at similar conclusions about what reliably helped. That convergence is itself a form of evidence. When every culture independently discovers that honey on a wound does something that plain water does not, that observation deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed until a clinical trial confirms it. Great-grandmothers did not dismiss observations that could not yet be explained. They used what worked and passed it forward. That is a form of scientific practice even when it does not use scientific language. Number 5. Plantain leaf poultice. Not the banana relative, but the common roadside weed with broad-ribbed leaves that grows in disturbed soil across every state in America. Great-grandmothers who knew plant medicine chewed a fresh plantain leaf into a paste and applied it to insect stings, minor cuts, and skin irritations as an immediate field treatment requiring nothing from a medicine cabinet. Plantain contains compounds including aucubin and allantoin that have demonstrated anti-inflammatory activity in research settings. The weed that great-grandmothers used as a first aid plant grows in most lawns and along most roadsides in America today, and is routinely killed with herbicide by homeowners who have no idea what they are eliminating. Number 4. Raw garlic and honey paste. This is a specific combination of raw garlic, crushed and allowed to rest for 10 minutes before being combined with raw honey. Take it by the spoonful at the onset of illness or through winter as a preventive. Letting the crushed garlic rest before mixing it with honey allows the allicin to fully develop. That step reflects specific preparation knowledge, not something discovered by accident. Great-grandmothers who insisted on the sequence crush, rest, then combine were preserving a preparation method that matters to the effectiveness of the result. That level of observation and refinement is not superstition. It is applied science practiced without a laboratory. Number 3. Fermented dairy. Kefir was maintained in Eastern European and Caucasian immigrant households as a living culture, passed between neighbors and generations, the way sourdough starters were passed. It served as a household resource that represented an ongoing investment in the family's health. Great-grandmothers who gave kefir to family members recovering from illness, to infants with digestive problems, and to elderly relatives with poor appetite were providing something that modern gastroenterology is only beginning to map in terms of its effects on gut microbiome diversity and immune function. The confidence of the tradition was born of generations of observation. The science to explain it came later. Number 2. Elderberry and ginger syrup. The recipe combined elderberries simmered with fresh ginger root, cinnamon, cloves, and honey, reduced to a thick syrup and stored in glass jars for the winter. It was the most consistently prepared and most consistently used preventive food medicine in the great-grandmother's seasonal arsenal. The ginger contributed its own anti-inflammatory and anti-nausea compounds alongside the elderberry flavonoids. The honey provided antimicrobial properties and made the syrup palatable enough that children took it without significant resistance. The combination of 3 independently studied compounds in a single preparation, used continuously for generations and confirmed by modern research to be effective in each component, is not folk superstition. It is a formula that worked well enough to survive unchanged for 100 years because the people using it kept observing that it worked. Number 1. Bone broth kept as a continuous household resource. Not made occasionally. Not made only when someone was already sick. It was maintained all the time, the pot on the back burner replenished as it was used, kept as the kitchen's permanent medical resource, the way a pharmacy keeps its shelves stocked. Great-grandmothers who kept a continuous bone broth pot were giving their households a daily source of collagen, gelatin, minerals, amino acids, and the compounds from whatever herbs and vegetables went into the pot. It required no preparation to use, it was always available, and it cost nothing beyond the bones that regular cooking already produced. Continuity was the whole practice. The bone broth was not a treatment for a specific complaint. It was the maintenance of a baseline nutritional environment in which illness was less likely and recovery was faster. Modern medicine has supplements for each component that bone broth provides, but great-grandmothers had the pot. The pot was better because it was always there, and because the compounds in it existed in relationship to each other in a way that no supplement combination has yet replicated. Make the pot. Keep it going. That is the whole instruction, and it is the most important one on this list. Here is my challenge. Pick one of these and bring it back into your kitchen this week. Make bone broth if you have bones in the freezer. Take raw honey and apple cider vinegar in warm water every morning for 2 weeks, and notice whether anything changes. Make elderberry syrup before winter comes and keep it in the refrigerator through the cold months. Then come back and tell me in the comments which one your great-grandmother used and whether you still use it yourself. This knowledge belongs to all of us, and far too much of it has already been lost to the assumption that if it cannot be purchased, it cannot be effective. Our great-grandmothers knew better. If we are paying attention, so do we.